the colonial period, one of the things that the British did in most of their colonies actually was set up a system of indirect rule. So Sierra Leone, of course, the boundary of that country, as all African countries, was drawn. They set up a capital of the country, and then they basically instituted a system of paramount chiefs that were to be the sort of agents of the British government in overseeing and extracting taxes from the populace. The British had to construct, or the Europeans basically, had to construct those who lived on the continent as inferior, as needing development, as impoverished. The assumption is, okay, great, when everybody's got a common enemy, which is the British, there's a lot of unity. But then as soon as the British went away, now you're like, okay, the question is, who's going to control government? And supposedly, there would be more self-determination on the part of Sierra Leoneans through their own national government. When you don't have a way to really turn that very realistically into something terribly productive, it ends up getting kind of whittled away. And that's when that's getting labeled corruption. But it needs to be understood in a context of what exactly is under the control of these various governments. But it did get pretty out of hand in the 80s. By the time of the war, the people weren't getting paid. You had sort of the money was just sort of getting dwindled, taken here and there. And you still had very few economic opportunities. And you basically had this kind of tinderbox that the war in Liberia ended up just sort of moving across the border and sparking. There was an ideal, there was a sense that if you participate in this movement and sort of take up arms against the state, we can create a new government, we can create a government that's actually going to lead to economic opportunity. And at the same time, and that was coupled with being a soldier, I they were going to be being taken care of, right? It was a livelihood as well. Things got completely out of control. Then it was, lots of things started to kind of get mixed and matched together. You had soldiers who then were sometimes rebels and sometimes working for the government and sometimes working for the more rebel leaders, and part of that had to do with who's going to provide me security. Right? Who can I sort of give my violent capacity to? Who's going to take care of my needs? After a while, it sort of didn't become much about any particular ideology, but more about who's in control of the violence and who's going to ensure that so-and-so's needs are met. Yeah. Sierra Leone has been held up as a very successful model of a post-conflict state. Now, in part, just money again poured in from the international community. In the city, you had a lot of rebuilding of buildings and that kind of infrastructure. But the cities also had huge amounts of refugees come, at first from Liberia, actually. Freetown had a ton of people from Liberia, so the population, and then also from the rural areas of Sierra Leone. So that population of Freetown has, I think, tripled since the start of the war. That's an issue, right? You've got the same space and all of these people. And again, not a lot of economic opportunity. I think the recovering in the villages has been a lot more about just really dealing with the trauma of war. You had people from these communities, just the young people taken, turned into soldiers, sometimes come back and do, harm to their own communities, living basically in the bush for 7 years. Babies couldn't cry. If a baby cried, that would give away the location of them to the rebels. And so the trauma, if you think about the trauma of living like that for about 7 years, that's pretty rough.
Yeah.
So the healing and the work of recovery in the villages is been a lot about that. I think that the wealth of other places is very visible all the time. And I think that in relation to that, people definitely understand and see that they don't have as much, and they don't have access to the same kinds of opportunities. They don't have access to the same kind of material goods, and don't really have a way to get that access. And I think that's that sort of structural piece. Seeing that there's not really a way to get that access is what's probably the most frustrating part for people. Now, in a day-to-day, going around doing your thing, are people always feeling that degree of poverty? No, right? I mean, I think that's probably the same case with people who live in poverty in other places. Yeah, and on one level, it's constantly felt, and in another level, it's what you got. Life expectancy is less. Children get sick, and it's really hard to get them better. And so there's a lot of ways that it's felt, that this sort of poverty is felt. But I guess I wouldn't want to say that people sort of live their lives thinking of themselves as poor, right? I mean, people have a good quality of life in a lot of other ways. And there's a lot of resilience in the Sierra Leone population. I think there's a lot of people who just, there's fun to be had, there's good relationships to be had, there's celebrations to be had, there's children to be raised, there's, parents to be cared for. And there's food to be produced, and that's kind of where, kind of life goes on. And I think that generally, I don't like the idea that some people say, well, they're poor, but they're happy. I mean, the wealth of this country is inextricably tied to the poverty of people in Africa. And I think that's absolutely critical to understand. To say that, well, they're poor, but they're happy is an easy way to be let off the hook. And that's problematic.